Hi, everybody. I'm Erin O'Brien. I'm going to be doing a spoken presentation today as my summer ended up being a bit all over the place due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to start out with an enormous thank you to Gallatin, to Mehmet, to Vasuki, to Kim, to Brander, Connor, Jennifer, Dean Wofford, and especially to all of my colleagues and all of the fellows here. I really think that all of our projects were strengthened and heightened by the discussions that we had both in the classroom and later in Zoom, and by sharing our thoughts and experiences with one another. I just have to express how valuable it is to see all of the work that you all did this summer today. I am a master's student in my second year in the global journalism program, partnered with Near Eastern Studies. I studied Iran and Persian studies in my undergraduate and then spent 3 years living in Istanbul after I graduated. I took this knowledge of Turkey and to focus my master's studies on Turkey, contemporary Turkey, and specifically legacies of violence in the Kurdish region. My master's thesis will grapple specifically with enforced disappearances, both in the 1990s and as a continued form of violence to this day. Initially, I was supposed to go to Istanbul and work with a grassroots news organization that functions primarily through Twitter and social media as a means of avoiding censorship called 98 or 98 News in Istanbul. However, after the travel ban was instituted and the COVID-19 pandemic kind of came upon all of us, I decided to refocus my efforts and my work somewhere in the US. At first, I was a little overwhelmed and I didn't quite know what to do. But then I started thinking about what had compelled me towards the sort of research that I do and towards the kind of work that I want to do in the future, specifically as a journalist focused in the human rights field. I began realizing that the reason why I felt that I wanted to and why I felt in a way compelled to do this work was because I felt that many in Turkey, especially in the aftermath of the 2016 attempted coup, had been silenced when pursuing these sort of topics. So I ended up working at PEN America, which is an organization at the intersection of human rights and literature, specifically on the Freedom of Expression Program, Writers at Risk program, which works to advocate for writers around the world who have been imprisoned, threatened, or charged as a result of their work. So Turkey actually constitutes the largest number of writers in the Writers at Risk database, which is what I was working on for the majority of this summer. So my knowledge of the country and my knowledge of the language actually ended up being incredibly helpful to the project, though it was based in the US. When I joined the team in May, they had just released their first interactive Writers at Risk database, which comprised over 500 writers, activists, columnists, and bloggers around the world who had been imprisoned or charged or murdered or threatened for their work. So what I did when I started out at Penn was kind of fill out the database, make sure things were up to date, fact check the different entries. And I found myself very weighed down, I think, initially in the work. By doing something that felt so quotidian and kind of like checking the boxes with regards to a topic that was so dire. So filling in a spreadsheet about someone dying as a result of a car bomb, or being murdered outside of their home for their expression and for their writing, I think really began to weigh on me. And it felt, especially when I was exploring a lot of things that had happened in years past, in the early 2000s or the 1990s, it felt kind of like, excuse the terminology, but violence porn. Like I was kind of being inundated with this violence, but not really sure what to do with the information. But then as the summer months began, and after George Floyd was killed on Memorial Day, I began to see kind of the relevance of this work more to the present day, and began to see the importance of young people like myself being involved in this sort of work going forward. there were two things this summer that really set off the importance of working on a freedom of expression program for me. The first was, as I said, the killing of George Floyd and the arrests that followed, and especially attacks on journalists in this country. And then the second was actually the COVID-19 pandemic, which I will focus on. So after the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic became clear, and lockdowns were instituted around the world, many countries around the world began using the pandemic, especially in places like Iran, Turkey, and China, as a means of silencing dissent. So while I began this project in a much more kind of administrative capacity, updating the database, making sure that cases were up to date, the onslaught of the coronavirus pandemic ended up, as you've seen with many of our projects, pushing my work in that direction. So I will give a few examples of people who were affected by this. For example, the writer Xu Jiang was put in solitary confinement, ostensibly to stop the spread of the virus. Several of the journalists who went to Wuhan in the early months of the outbreak to report via social media about the outbreak and about the response and about the Chinese government's kind of obfuscation of the facts surrounding the pandemic were also imprisoned. So our advocacy at Penn ended up shifting to that and going from something that felt very administrative to something that felt incredibly immediate and incredibly important and incredibly fast-paced, which I think was a somewhat rare experience working at a fairly large and global NGO. And then in the later months of the summer, we started seeing these same crackdowns in Iran, in the Middle East, and specifically in Iran and Turkey and Saudi Arabia. There were several feminist activists and writers who have been imprisoned in Saudi Arabia, among them Loujain al-Haful, who have all been held incommunicado as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, have been denied access to their friends, to their family, and those that know and love them have received very little communication. There was also the case of a writer named Nargis Mohammadi in Iran who contracted the coronavirus, but the Iranian authorities denied that she had contracted the virus. They gave her a test on camera. They sent it out to kind of state-sponsored news to say that she had been tested negative, but our team was in contact with her family the entire time, raising awareness about the fact that she had contracted coronavirus and had a range of other health issues that were putting her at risk. And again, as kind of the effect of the COVID virus on these writers and on their ability to express themselves began to become clear, I once again kind of felt that Sisyphean feeling of we're doing all this work, we're trying to raise awareness, we're putting out press statements, we're working with different organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and different UN offices, but it feels like nothing is happening. And then the case of Nasrin Sotoudeh came along. So we started, Nasrin Sotoudeh has been arrested several times in Iran. She is a human rights lawyer, and most recently she was arrested in 2019 for advocating for women who refused to wear a headscarf in public in Iran. She herself was further punished for showing up to court without wearing a headscarf. So she has been, though the terms of her sentence are not entirely clear, she has been sentenced to over 28 years in prison and was given 148 lashes for her work. So Nasrin has a range of other health problems, including heart palpitations, respiratory issues as a result of having been tortured and kept in Evin prison, the notorious Evin prison in Iran. So we were in touch with her husband Reza the entire time, and it became clear that she, with her pre-existing conditions, was at high risk of contracting and potentially dying from the coronavirus. In early August, Nasrin then began a hunger strike to protest conditions for prisoners in Iran's prisons who were contracting COVID-19 at incredibly high rates and were being kept in incredibly unsafe, unsanitary, and crowded conditions. Immediately, we started advocating after she began her hunger strike, releasing press statements, and I'm so sorry. And again, I felt this kind of overwhelming Sisyphean task of like we weren't going to do anything. But after several press statements and reaching out to UN offices, we ended up gaining a lot of attention and actually ended up being tweeted by Hillary Clinton, by Joe Biden. She was brought up in UNGA in the UN General Assembly, and now her case is being argued at the highest levels of both the UN and the European Parliament. And so I think that I'll wrap up my presentation, but I think that what I learned this summer is that though these kind of organizations and this kind of work can feel very endless and can feel very hopeless, and it is very, very daunting to approach these kind of topics like freedom of expression and like suppression in a pandemic like COVID-19. What I realized is that actually these sometimes repetitive feeling tasks and this kind of work, just doing research and advocating for these people, can actually have an enormous effect, as we saw with the case of Nasrin Sotoudeh. And going forward, I think I'll realize that putting in the work, doing the activism on the ground, and making sure to do everything that you can from your position of privilege to get the word out about human rights abuses can actually make a difference in the end, though it can seem fairly Sisyphean.